There comes a moment in life when the noise fades, when the roles you've played no longer fit, and the ambitions that once drove you suddenly feel distant. This moment often arrives disguised as emptiness. You may try to fill it with distractions, achievements, or explanations, but nothing seems to settle it. Yet emptiness is not a failure of the soul, it is an invitation. It appears when something old has completed its purpose, and something deeper is asking to emerge. Letting go is not an act of weakness, it is an act of intelligence. The psyche cannot evolve while clinging to outdated identities, wounds, or expectations. What you call emptiness is often the space created when the unconscious begins to loosen its grip on what no longer serves your growth. The mind resists this space because it cannot control it, but the soul recognizes it as fertile ground. When you hold on too tightly to past versions of yourself, you prevent the natural process of renewal. Old attachments demand constant energy, quietly draining your vitality. Letting go does not mean erasing the past, it means releasing its authority over the present. Integration happens not by fighting what was, but by allowing it to settle into wisdom rather than memory. Emptiness teaches patience. It strips away false certainty and forces you into direct contact with yourself. In this state, you are no longer defined by approval, productivity, or comparison. You begin to sense a deeper orientation, one that does not depend on external validation. This is where true alignment begins, in the quiet space where nothing needs to be proven. The fear of letting go comes from the illusion that without what you cling to, you will disappear. In truth, what disappears is the mask. What remains is more whole, more grounded, and more real. The psyche seeks balance, and when imbalance persists for too long, it creates discomfort to restore harmony. Emptiness is that corrective signal. When you stop resisting the void, it begins to speak. Insight replaces anxiety, clarity replaces confusion. You realize that letting go is not about losing yourself, it is about returning to yourself. What feels like an ending is often the psyche preparing you for a more authentic beginning, one that arises not from fear or habit, but from inner truth. Emptiness is not a flaw, but a signal of inner transition and renewal, a quiet message arising when the structures that once supported your sense of self begin to dissolve. It often appears when familiar motivations lose their force, when old desires no longer inspire movement, and when the identity you once relied upon feels strangely distant. The mind interprets this state as something gone wrong, yet the psyche does not create emptiness without purpose. It emerges precisely when an internal reorganization is underway, when the deeper layers of the self are loosening attachments that have outlived their meaning. This emptiness is not the absence of life, but the suspension of the old. It is the pause between breaths, the stillness between seasons, the silence before a deeper truth finds language. Much of human suffering comes from trying to escape this space too quickly, from rushing to refill it with noise, productivity, or borrowed identities. But emptiness asks to be inhabited, not avoided. It is the internal environment in which renewal can occur, because only when something is cleared can something more authentic take shape. Inner transition rarely announces itself with clarity. It disrupts first. What once felt stable begins to feel hollow, not because it was meaningless, but because its task is complete. The psyche seeks growth through balance, and when a way of being has been fully lived, it naturally withdraws its energy from it. This withdrawal is experienced as emptiness, yet beneath the discomfort lies intelligence. The inner life is redirecting attention away from external roles and toward deeper integration. Emptiness also dismantles illusion. It strips away the belief that fulfillment comes solely from achievement, recognition, or control. In this stripped-down state, you are confronted with yourself without ornament or distraction. This can feel unsettling because it removes the familiar reference points by which you once measured your worth. But it is precisely this removal that allows a more grounded sense of self to emerge, one rooted not in performance but in presence. When allowed to unfold naturally, Emptiness becomes a teacher. It cultivates patience, humility, and self-honesty. It reveals unconscious attachments that once operated unnoticed. It exposes where meaning was borrowed rather than discovered. In this sense, emptiness is not a void but a mirror, reflecting what is essential by dissolving what is superficial. Renewal does not arrive by force, it arrives when resistance softens. As the mind stops demanding immediate answers, subtle insights begin to surface. New values take shape quietly. A different orientation toward life begins to form, one less reactive and more intentional. What replaces emptiness is not the old fullness you once knew, but a deeper coherence, a sense of alignment that arises from within rather than from circumstance. Thus, emptiness marks a threshold. It is the psychological crossing from one stage of being to another. Though uncomfortable, it carries the promise of renewal for those willing to remain present within it. What feels like loss is often transformation in its earliest, most fragile form, asking only for awareness, trust, and time to become whole again. Letting go is a conscious act of growth, not weakness, because it requires awareness, courage, and a deep willingness to face uncertainty without collapsing into fear. Weakness clings for safety, but growth releases in order to evolve. When a person lets go, they are not surrendering to defeat. They are recognizing that something has reached the end of its usefulness. This recognition does not come easily. It emerges only after inner resistance has been examined and understood. Much of what people hold on to is not sustained by love or truth, but by habit and identity. Old beliefs, emotional wounds, and self-definitions offer familiarity, even when they quietly restrict vitality. Letting go threatens the structure of the known self, and the mind interprets this threat as danger. Yet psychological development demands periodic dissolution. Without release, the inner world becomes rigid, repeating patterns long after their meaning has faded. Letting go is conscious because it involves discernment. It asks you to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely comfortable. This discernment requires honesty, the kind that does not flatter the ego. You begin to see how much energy is spent defending outdated narratives, reliving past pain, or trying to control outcomes that no longer respond. Choosing to let go is choosing to redirect that energy toward integration rather than repetition. There is strength in allowing grief, uncertainty, and vulnerability to surface without immediately numbing them. Weakness avoids these states by distraction or denial. Growth stays present. When you let go, you allow the psyche to complete unfinished emotional cycles. Feelings that were once suppressed are given space to move and transform. This process can feel like loss, but it is actually a recalibration, restoring balance where tension once dominated. Letting go also reshapes the relationship with control. The need to control often arises from fear of instability, yet life itself is dynamic and cannot be frozen without distortion. Conscious release is an acknowledgement of this truth. It reflects trust in the psyche's capacity to reorganize itself. Rather than forcing clarity, you allow meaning to emerge organically, shaped by insight rather than compulsion. Growth through letting go does not erase the past, it integrates it. Experiences are not discarded but absorbed as understanding. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity. The emotional charge attached to old stories dissolves, leaving behind perspective instead of pain. This is not weakness, it is refinement. As layers fall away, a more authentic orientation toward life becomes possible. You respond rather than react. You choose rather than repeat. Letting go frees attention from what has already happened and returns it to the present, where real agency exists. In this way, letting go becomes an act of inner leadership. It signals readiness for a new stage of psychological maturity, grounded in awareness, resilience, and quiet strength rather than. Holding on to old identities drains psychological energy because the self is not a fixed structure but a living process. An identity is useful only for as long as it reflects who you are becoming. When it no longer does, maintaining it requires constant effort. This effort is often invisible, yet it manifests as fatigue, restlessness, emotional numbness, or a persistent sense of inner conflict. The psyche expends energy trying to preserve an image that no longer aligns with its natural direction of growth. Old identities are formed through past roles, achievements, wounds, and adaptations. At one time, they offered coherence and protection. They helped you navigate circumstances, gain belonging, or survive emotionally. But what once served development can later obstruct it. When life conditions change or inner values mature, the identity remains frozen in an earlier stage. The psyche then faces a split. One part knows it has outgrown the old self, while another continues to defend it out of fear or habit. This internal split is where energy loss begins. Maintaining an outdated identity demands constant self-monitoring. You must think, act, and react in ways that keep the image intact. Spontaneity decreases, creativity dulls, and emotional responsiveness narrows. Much of your inner vitality is spent suppressing impulses that contradict who you believe you are supposed to be. Over time, this suppression accumulates as tension, anxiety, or a vague sense of emptiness. The mind often confuses identity with stability. Letting go of an old self can feel like erasing certainty, as though without it there will be nothing to stand on. Yet clinging to what is familiar does not create stability, it creates stagnation. True stability comes from alignment, not repetition. When identity lags behind inner reality, the psyche must work overtime to compensate, generating stress rather than grounding. Old identities also anchor emotional patterns that no longer reflect present truth. You may continue reacting from past wounds, defending against threats that no longer exist. The body and nervous system remain in outdated modes of response, consuming energy through chronic vigilance or emotional guarding. This is exhausting because the system is constantly responding to yesterday instead of today. Releasing old identities does not mean becoming undefined. It means allowing identity to become flexible rather than rigid. As attachment loosens, energy previously locked into maintenance becomes available for awareness, creativity, and genuine connection. You feel lighter not because responsibilities disappear, but because inner resistance dissolves. When identity aligns with current reality, the psyche moves efficiently. There is less friction between who you are and how you live. Thoughts become clearer, emotions flow more naturally, and attention is no longer scattered. What was once drained through self-preservation is now redirected toward growth. Thus, holding on to old identities is costly not because the past was wrong, but because it has already completed its function. Growth requires periodic release. When you allow identity to evolve, psychological energy returns, not as excitement or ambition, but as a quiet sense of coherence and inner ease that no longer needs to be defended. True ration comes from releasing control, not resisting the past, because the psyche does not heal through force. Resistance keeps experiences fragmented, locked in opposition to the present moment. When the mind attempts to control inner life by suppressing memories, emotions, or impulses, it creates division rather than wholeness. What is pushed away does not disappear. It remains active beneath awareness, quietly shaping reactions, fears, and patterns. Integration begins only when this inner battle softens. The urge to control the past often arises from shame, regret, or pain. The mind believes that by rejecting what has been, it can protect the present self from discomfort, yet this rejection demands constant vigilance. Energy is spent maintaining distance from parts of the self that are still alive within the psyche. The past then returns indirectly, expressed through projections, compulsions, or emotional triggers that feel disproportionate to current circumstances. Releasing control does not mean approving of what happened or resigning oneself to it. It means allowing the past to exist as part of the inner landscape without demanding that it be different. This allowance creates space for understanding. When memories and emotions are met without judgment, they lose their urgency. They are no longer fighting to be acknowledged. In this way, what once felt intrusive becomes informative. Integration is an act of listening rather than managing. Each unresolved experience carries information about unmet needs, adaptive strategies, or lost aspects of the self. When control is loosened, these elements can be examined with curiosity instead of fear. The psyche naturally moves toward coherence when given permission. It seeks balance, not perfection. Resisting the past freezes development. It traps consciousness in a defensive posture, always oriented toward avoidance. Growth then becomes reactive rather than intentional. Releasing control shifts this orientation. Attention turns inward, not to correct or fix, but to understand and relate. This relational stance allows old experiences to find their proper place within the larger story of the self. As resistance dissolves, emotional charge begins to soften. Painful memories lose their ability to dominate awareness. They are still remembered, but they no longer define identity. The past is integrated not as a wound, but as context. This transformation does not occur through effortful thinking, but through sustained presence. Letting go of control also restores trust in the psyche's self-regulating capacity. The mind no longer needs to micromanage inner life. Feelings arise and pass without overwhelming the system. Insight emerges organically. This trust is not naive, it is earned through experience of inner stability that does not depend on suppression. Through this process, wholeness becomes possible. The self is no longer divided into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Each experience, even the difficult ones, is acknowledged as having contributed to development. Integration is not about erasing the past, but about ending the struggle against it. In releasing control, the psyche regains fluidity, and in that fluidity, true inner unity quietly takes shape. Emptiness creates space for authenticity and inner alignment, because it removes the noise that normally defines who you think you are. When familiar motivations fall silent and old desires no longer compel action, what remains can feel unsettling. Yet this quiet is not accidental. It emerges when the psyche withdraws energy from roles, habits, and ambitions that no longer reflect inner truth. In this withdrawal, space opens, and in that space, authenticity begins to breathe. Much of daily identity is constructed through expectation. You learn who to be by adapting to approval, necessity, and survival. Over time, these adaptations harden into patterns that feel natural, even when they no longer resonate. Emptiness disrupts the patterns. It interrupts automatic striving and exposes the gap between how you live and what you genuinely value. This interruption can feel like loss, but it is actually clarification. When external reference points fade, attention turns inward. Without constant stimulation, the psyche becomes more sensitive to subtle signals. You begin to notice what drains you and what quietly sustains you. Authenticity does not announce itself loudly. It emerges as a sense of ease, a reduction in inner friction. Emptiness allows this recognition because it removes the pressure to perform or conform. Inner alignment cannot be forced. It develops when actions, values, and emotional truth begin to resonate with one another. Emptiness creates the conditions for this resonance by clearing internal clutter. Old desires dissolve, not because they were wrong, but because they no longer match your present state of development. As they fade, space is made for intentions that arise from deeper understanding rather than compulsion. This space also reveals unconscious contradictions. Without distraction, you become aware of where you are living against yourself. This awareness can be uncomfortable, yet it is essential. Authenticity requires honesty, and emptiness makes self-deception difficult to sustain. You are no longer distracted by external noise, so the inner voice grows clearer. Alignment brings a different quality of motivation. Instead of urgency or anxiety, there is steadiness. Choices feel less dramatic and more natural. You stop forcing direction and begin sensing it. Emptiness supports this shift by dissolving false urgency. It teaches patience, allowing direction to emerge organically. As authenticity deepens, life becomes simpler, not necessarily easier, but more coherent. Energy once spent maintaining appearances or chasing validation becomes available for presence. Relationships change as well, because you no longer relate from obligation or fear, but from truth. This may reduce quantity, but it deepens quality. Emptiness, then, is not something to escape. It is a transitional space where alignment is recalibrated. In allowing it, you permit the psyche to reorganize itself around what is real rather than what is expected. What fills the space is not noise but clarity, not certainty but congruence. Through emptiness, you return to a way of being that feels quietly aligned, internally consistent, and authentically your own. Letting go reveals the self beneath the masks, not the loss of self, because what falls away in the process is not identity itself, but the layers that were built for protection, approval, and survival. These masks form early, shaped by circumstance, expectation, and the need to belong. Over time, they become so familiar that they are mistaken for the true self. Letting go threatens this familiarity, which is why it is often misunderstood as self-erasure, when in reality it is self-revelation. Masks exist to manage the world. They regulate how much of you is shown, which emotions are permitted, and which impulses must remain hidden. At one time, these adaptations were intelligent responses to your environment. But as inner capacity grows, the masks remain rigid, continuing to shape behavior long after the original need has passed. Maintaining them requires constant effort. You monitor your reactions, filter your expression, and restrain parts of yourself to remain consistent with an image. This effort fragments inner experience. Letting go begins when the strain of maintaining these roles becomes impossible to ignore. Fatigue, emptiness, or emotional disconnection often signal that the distance between who you are and who you present has grown too wide. The psyche seeks coherence. When coherence is threatened, it creates discomfort to prompt change. Letting go is the response to that prompt. As masks loosen, vulnerability emerges. This is where fear arises, because vulnerability feels like exposure without defense. The mind equates this exposure with danger, assuming that without the mask, nothing solid will remain. Yet what emerges is not chaos, but presence. The self beneath the masks is less performative and more responsive. It is not constructed, it is experienced. This deeper self is not defined by roles or narratives, but by orientation. It is felt as congruence between thought, emotion, and action. When you let go of rigid self-definitions, inner conflict diminishes. You no longer have to uphold a version of yourself that contradicts your lived reality. Energy returns, not because life becomes easier, but because resistance decreases. Letting go does not strip meaning from life, it refines it. Relationships become more honest, though sometimes fewer. Choices become clearer, though sometimes more demanding. You act less from habit and more from understanding. The self that emerges is not louder or more impressive, but quieter and more stable. What letting go is not a constructed persona, but a lived reality. Simple, coherent, and quietly whole. So if you find yourself standing at the edge of uncertainty, feeling as though something familiar is dissolving, do not rush to replace it. What is falling away was never the core of who you are. It was a covering, a strategy, a temporary shape. Let it loosen without fear. Beneath it is a self that does not need constant explanation or defense. Letting go is not disappearance, it is emergence. And when the masks fall, what remains is not less of you, but the truest form you have yet to live.